and the medicine was really primitive at that time. And I want to know what went on behind their psyche and how they thought about approaching certain diseases, what they thought about the pathologies, and obviously surgery was not a really big thing at the time, and how they approached cases that were very that are now treated with surgery.
Okay,
So
good. So this is a question, one of those questions where there is no right or wrong answer, and you're not expecting somebody to ask you this, so you have to think about it, and then just go ahead and give your response. Hippocrates and this Dr. Paula, I've heard of this person.
Rada.
Yeah, those are two great people. They don't have to be in unless they say like they need to be in medicine, but they can be any people. Some people say like I would have dinner with my parents. Or my two kids, or it can be someone really obscure. I want to have dinner with Taylor Swift and Kim Kardashian, or I want to have dinner with LeBron James and Michelle Obama. It can be anybody you want. This is just more of a personality question to see like what your interests are, who you would be interested in having dinner with, those sorts of things. So good job answering that. You were a lot of people can't give me an answer, which is kind of funny. I'm like, you can literally give me any answer, like you can tell me any two names, and they're like, I don't know, and I'm like, this isn't a hard question. You don't need to think about this too much. So nicely done there.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Yep. All right. Let's turn over to the chat, and I can answer you guys' questions for the next 15 minutes or so, or however long we need to answer all the questions. Before we do that, again, I see that Ellie's provided some links here to our interview prep packages. So you guys saw a lot of these are just very basic questions that everybody that does interview prep with me will be asked at some point. I have a whole document that has like 200 questions on it that I go through, and I have everything from the high yield, very common, basic interview questions to like really weird questions that if you're doing really well, then I move on to those questions and I make you uncomfortable. But I will go through, you'll get asked all different types of questions. You'll get detailed feedback. Sometimes, if there's certain things that you're struggling with, we'll go through and we may practice your answer, 2 or 3 times. And if we're doing multiple sessions, we'll go back and we'll tackle those same questions over and over again each session. And it's really great and satisfying for me because it's like, especially for the first session, people oftentimes really struggle. And then as they move on to the second session, they get a lot better. And then the third session, they're just nice and polished. And it's just really satisfying for me to watch you guys get better and better over the course of 2-3 weeks even sometimes. So I think that most of the people that I work with, if not, I would say the vast majority, are really satisfied with the results, and they think that it helps them. So I would take a look into this if you have a couple interviews coming up and you're unsure about your ability to perform. Take a look at our packages. If you want to do sessions with me, you can request me. I have availability all throughout the week and most times on the weekends, so we can find something. Or if you want to work with a couple different people, if you buy like a 3-hour package, you can do 2 sessions with me and a session with somebody else, or 3 sessions with 3 different people, because that's oftentimes what it will be like on the interview trail. Those are all different things you guys can do. So take a look at those packages. All right, so if anybody has questions, please type them in now. I'm going to just go from the beginning of the chat and work my way down. So the first one's from Asha. She says, how to answer negative traits of internal and family medicine. I don't think anybody's going to ask you to list negative traits about the specialty that you're applying into, if that's what you're asking. They're not going to, these things will typically be more positive, so they're not going to ask you to negotiate or talk about negative traits of a specialty. Next, we have a question here. Do you suggest sending the letter of interest to the program director or program coordinator, given that the number of emails that might be possible to send to the PDs? I don't want to clog your emails as well. Okay, so this is a good question. This was probably back when I was yakking about letters of interest. You should send the letter of interest to the program director and carbon copy the program coordinator, who's kind of like their secretary. Oftentimes, both of these people will be listed on the website. If you cannot find the program director and program coordinator on the website, something you can do is ask ChatGPT. I try to double check it, but see if ChatGPT can tell you the name of the program coordinator. Oftentimes it does, it can do that. It's done it before for me in the past when I've been trying to find program directors, and it's even given me their emails. So, while we were saying it may not take the job of doctors, it is very good and efficient at finding email addresses and names of program directors and coordinators. So that's another hack that you can use there. And then just send the email to both the PD and the program coordinator. Is it wise to mention in the interview that I only got one interview and really want to match there? I don't think I would go that far. I don't think it's necessarily going to hurt you, but it could make you seem like damaged goods if like they're the only program that interviewed you. But you can mention that you're really interested in that program, and that you're going to, that you can even come out and say that they're your number one choice. Again, that's, it's not necessarily going to help you when you say that to a program, because you can literally tell every program that they're your number one choice. So it's, they take that with a grain of salt, but, you can be enthusiastic. You can tell them that you're really interested in training there, and, ask the residents questions that demonstrate that you're really, really interested. Like, where do you live? Do you rent or do you sell? What neighborhoods do you recommend living in? Those are questions that like make you think like, okay, this person is really seriously thinking about coming here. They're thinking about where they're going to live, and all of those different things. What schools do you send your kids to? Those kinds of questions can demonstrate that you are seriously considering that program. What if you get asked about why you didn't signal the program or why it isn't in your geo preference? So geo preferences, they're probably not going to ask you why that you didn't get why you didn't list it in your geographic preferences. I mean, at the end of the day, you can only pick 3 areas of the country, and a program could be a program that you're really interested in, but just maybe as a whole, it's not your number one geographic area. So you probably wouldn't be asked that. If they asked about why you didn't signal the program, just say, we only have so many signals, and at the end of the day, I really think this is a great program. It just wasn't at the top of my list, and that's it. It would be strange, I would say. I've had people ask me this question before, and I think that's a really awkward question for them to ask you, like, why didn't they signal you? There's no good way to answer. At the end of the day, you didn't signal them because they just weren't one of the top programs that you signaled. So I would be surprised if they asked you this program. That's kind of an awkward question. And if if you get asked that, I would say the way to answer it is that, you're really impressed with their program. And at the end of the day, you were only allowed so many signals, and you didn't have enough signals to give to all of the programs that you're really interested in. How specific should the why this program be? My true reason for applying to a program can apply to many programs and is likely a common answer. Exactly, yeah. So I have been adding has a strong NICU or large PEDS-ED, but still feels too generic. Can I mention that I want to live in the area as well? Yes. So Hannah, what you need to mention is like talk about the program, talk about the area where the program is in, the patient population that they deal with. Talk about, you can even say like, I went to your Instagram page and I saw that, the program director hosted the interns over. It seems like the residents really get along, and that the program itself is more of a family. I like the city. There's a lot of great places to live, and it's somewhere where I can see myself living and raising my family. You can mention specific things about the program, whether it's having a large PEDS-ED or a strong NICU or whatever. You can also mention, the residents that have graduated have gone on to do really impressive things. They've gone on to do fellowship, or they've gone on to work at leading academic centers. So, you want to be as specific as you can. Again, I would just, you kind of got to do this one program at a time. When you get that interview for the program and that interview's coming up, just take a day or two to go and look around and see what is on their website. What are they most proud of? And kind of just try to parrot that back to them. How to answer why didn't you match last year? I mean, that's a tough question. Again, these are very uncomfortable questions that you may be asked, but again, I don't know if they would necessarily know that. They also may not know that you didn't match last year. So unless you mentioned that in your personal statement, they may not know that. But if you did advertise that in your application, talk about why you think you didn't match. Answer the question, whether it was that you think that you didn't, do enough clinical, U.S. clinical experiences, you didn't have, strong enough letters of recommendation, do a credit, be honest there. Don't be too honest. Don't be like, I'm a bad applicant, but like talk about things that maybe you modified this year that you didn't have in your application last year. I'm struggling with this question, especially with my orthopedic surgery background applying for internal medicine. So I'm assuming the question would be why internal medicine when you have a background in orthopedic surgery. It's okay, you can talk about, especially if it's a research background, you can talk about being involved with that, but talk about, what ultimately drew you to internal medicine. Your background doesn't dictate what you have to do. I went to medical school with a person who did an entire PhD in neuroscience, and then she ended up matching into general surgery. She thought she was going to do neurology or psych, and then did her general surgery rotation and was like, oh, this is great. And then like got interviews at all of the top places. And, it's just your background, the skills that you have learned, whether it was in orthopedic surgery clinically or whether it was in orthopedic surgery from a research standpoint, those are skills that you can use in internal medicine. Which platform can I find the session recording? Okay, yeah, I'll let the advisor, match guy, Ellie, to tell you guys the answer to that, because they'll probably either put it on YouTube or up on our social media. How did you find out about this program? They're probably not going to ask you that. They're going to ask you, what they're going to ask you is why did you apply to our program? Not like, how did you find about our program? The programs are, it's not like this is like a company that you found on Instagram or like found on Google or something like that. They're going to ask you, why did you apply to our program? Does the residency program record our interview? No. How to answer the question, what does work ethic mean to you? This is a thought-provoking question, but what does work ethic mean to you? It's also a very esoteric question, but everybody's going to have a different answer to this question. These are kind of the questions that I don't know if anybody will ever ask you this question, but these are like the weird questions that people will come into the interview prep sessions, and sometimes we spend 5 minutes. I'll have a conversation with them about what they think work ethic means to them, and we'll both kind of brainstorm an answer to it. But this is a low yield question that you may never be asked. You should be focusing on like, how am I going to answer? Tell me about yourself. Why the specialty and why the program? Can you please give some general tips and suggestions that you would like to see in an interview candidate? I would say, just be yourself. At the end of the day, I want you to be yourself, be authentic. I want you to, it's okay if you're nervous. Everybody's nervous. That's totally normal. But what I like to see is that you're being thoughtful. I like to see that you are well prepared, especially if I'm asking you questions that you should be prepared for, like, why the specialty, or tell me about a time where you had a conflict. Tell me about yourself. And if I ask you a thought-provoking question, give me an answer. If I ask somebody like, you get to have dinner with 2 people, dead or alive, who's it going to be? Like, and you can't give me an answer. It's like, this isn't a hard question. I'm not asking you to explain entropy to me. So what I'm looking for in an applicant is, it's really hard to distill down to one thing, but it's like asking somebody what you're looking for in a boyfriend or a girlfriend when you go on a first date. You just need to be your honest self, and at the end of the day, if you're a good fit, if you're a good match, it's going to work out. How to answer? Tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker. You need to talk about a time that you had a conflict with a coworker. That's how you answer that question. It doesn't need to be a massive conflict. It can be a small disagreement, like we talked about earlier with the volunteer who, they were pre-rounding and they realized that the co-resident and her had a disagreement about a patient's pantoprazole dose. It can be something as small as that. It doesn't need to be a massive conflict, but you should be able to talk about at least some conflict that you had, either clinically or from if you were doing research or in some capacity. People were like, I've never had a conflict, and I'm like, well, I don't believe that. You lived your entire life and you've never had a conflict. God bless you. Tell me a joke. How to answer this question? Tell them a joke. I wouldn't tell them a dirty joke, but just oftentimes think of the first joke that comes to your head. I remember somebody asked me this question when I was in the OR on one of my sub-Is. They're like, Jim, tell us a joke. And I have this whole series of jokes. They're really dumb, but it's like, what do you call a man with no arms and no legs in the ocean? Bob. What do you call a man with no arms and no legs on a wall? Art. What do you call a man with no arms and no legs, in a pile of leaves? Russell. Like, these are all stupid jokes, but like jokes that you can tell. So just tell them a joke. There's no right or wrong answer to that. What can we talk about during the meet and greet if it's in person or virtual? Whatever you want. Talk about yourself. Ask the residents, to tell them about themselves. These are all questions. All the questions that you can be asked, you can ask these questions of the residents. Get to know them. Get to see what they do for fun, what they're interested in, what rotation they're on right now, how they like it, etc. In your point of view, how can we avoid falling into the trap of question, what is your weakness? So it's not a trap question. This is just a question where you need to give a weakness that is either a benign weakness that you can modify or a weakness that could be perceived as a strength. So things like, I tend to overanalyze situations, that's a weakness. Or I have a hard time delegating tasks because I like to do everything myself and it makes me inefficient. I have a hard time saying no. I tend to say yes to everything, and I oftentimes get bogged down with a bunch of different tasks that I agree to do. What are some other weaknesses? Like, I need to work on being more assertive. I'm kind of shy and soft-spoken, so I've been, working on, putting myself in leadership situations where I have to speak up and speak in front of people to overcome this fear. Those are what you want to answer. You don't want to be too honest there. You don't want to say that, like, I have a bad temper, I'm always late, and I have bad breath, but you want to give either a soft weakness or a weakness that could be perceived as a strength. His first and foremost questionnaire ID would probably be, tell me about yourself. Yes, so the question is how to frame that answer in under 90 to 120 seconds, and also what to include from the beginning of our career and what are the things which should be avoided to start with. So this is someone asking me how to answer the tell me about yourself question. So, again, I talked a lot about this earlier in the session. You just need to tell your story. You need to do it in under 2 minutes. So, we had one volunteer who did a really good job earlier. You give me a little bit about your background, where you're from, what drew you to medicine, where you went to medical school, if you're an IMG, when you made the decision to come to the United States. Tell me a little bit about your U.S. clinical experiences, and then just a little bit about yourself, your hobbies, your interests, and that's it. I would say practice this, record yourself and listen to yourself. So when you do the voice recording on your phone, don't look at the timer when you're practicing it, just kind of see where you're at. But you may need to practice this a lot to get down to under 2 minutes, and that's okay. Eventually you'll get there. Next, please tell me how to answer the question. Tell me about a time you had to deal with a difficult attending. I've never been asked this question. I've never heard of anybody asking this question, but if you've had to deal with a difficult attending, talk about a time where maybe you had to deal with that attending, and maybe this was an attending who was very challenging to work with. Maybe they were insulting or whatever, and maybe you just needed to put your head down and work through that. And even if you disagreed with the attending, you wanted to be professional and you didn't want to necessarily challenge their authority. So you just kind of kept your head down. You managed, focused on working with your patients and delivering the best care you could for your patients, and you didn't take anything personally. But this would be a strange question to ask. I've never had someone ask me this question. I've never heard of this question being asked, but I guess theoretically you could be asked this question. Again, these are the things that people worry about, and I would worry less about answering this question and more about tell me about yourself, because I don't know if you'll ever be asked this question, but you're going to be asked tell me about yourself at the next interview. And if your tell me about yourself isn't perfect, you only have yourself to blame. So those are, you're going to be asked why the specialty, not tell me about a time where you had a bad attending. Like, I don't know if you're going to be asked that question, and it's probably not worth your time worrying about how to answer that question when you can absolutely worry about answering the questions that you're going to be asked. While you were working, was there a policy that you did not agree with? How to answer this tricky question? Again, I don't know. I mean, this is, we could talk about, was there a policy that you did not agree with? I don't know. Like, maybe there wasn't a policy that you didn't disagree with. Maybe you agreed with everything. Maybe you disagreed with the 80-hour work week policy. I don't know. again, this is a very, very strange question. So we could spend all day. I could have all 40 people here say, come up with a question that you're trying to answer. Like, tell me about a time where you had to deal with an attending that you didn't like when you were working. Was there a policy that did you not agree with? Again, it's like, I don't know where you've worked. I don't know what work experiences you've had. So if this was something you wanted to work on answering, we could talk about this in one of our sessions and try to figure out a specific answer to this question. But again, you're kind of falling into the trap here of like trying to answer these questions like it's a USMLE question. Again, I don't know if you'll ever be asked this question. And if you were asked this question in one prior interview, I highly doubt that you'll be asked this again. Do I have to use a clip-on microphone? Would that add any value? No. How should I answer what I've changed since last year? I would answer it honestly. Like, what have you changed since last year? If you're applying again, what have you done differently this time? How should I answer why I did not match? Again, think about, critically think about why you did not match. What changes to the application have you made this year versus last year? Maybe you added a new observership and one volunteer work this year. So you could say, maybe my clinical experiences were not as robust, so I've done an additional observership, and I've also tried to expand my extracurriculars by volunteering with X, Y, or Z. How do we answer conflict with an attending question? I don't know if they're ever going to ask you, have you had a conflict with an attending? Because if I'm being honest with you, most medical students do not have conflicts with an attending. If you're a medical student and you've had a conflict with an attending, that means that something probably has went wrong. They may ask you, have you had a conflict with a peer or a conflict with someone, but maybe not necessarily a conflict with an attending. Again, that would almost be like, I think that's what people think when I'm asking them the conflict question. Like, I've never had a conflict with an attending. It's like, yes, good. You've never had a conflict with an attending. Most medical students do not. Most medical students don't have conflicts with like even their residents. But maybe you had a conflict with another student, or maybe you were working with a team. Maybe it wasn't you in particular, but maybe you and your resident who were managing a patient had a conflict with another resident who was a consultant for that patient. That's another way to answer that question. It can be not necessarily a conflict you personally had with somebody, but a conflict that your team had with another team. That's another way to answer that question. How well do you take criticism? Strange question. Not that strange. So this is another question. How do you take criticism? How do you take feedback? The way you answer is this: you don't take it personally. If somebody's giving you feedback, they're giving you feedback because they want to make you better. So you need to think about critically about that feedback. So a question that I ask people all the time, a behavioral question, is, what's the harshest piece of feedback that you've ever received from a resident or an attending? Or tell me about a time where you had some tough feedback. How did you manage that? What goals do you want to reach by the end of residency? Again, this is, what are your goals for the future? What are you hoping to be able to achieve at the end of residency? You answer that honestly. I have 30-minute interview with 4 interviewers and 5-minute break in between. I'm worried about how much content do I need to make a conversation. I don't think that you're not going to be the one who's responsible for generating content. I think that, again, most of these interviews will be very conversational, especially if they're 30 minutes. So, the interviews will be asking you questions and you'll answer, and then they'll interject, and it's not going to be an interrogation. It's going to be more of a conversation. 30-minute interviews with 5-minute breaks in between, that is a lot. But honestly, I preferred that when I was interviewing. The worst thing that I hated was when I would have like a 30-minute interview and then like a 45-minute or a 1-hour break, because then you're just like sitting there and you're like waiting for the next interview. When I've had those interviews where it was just like one interview after another, it seems kind of scary on paper, but when you actually are doing it, you're like, all of a sudden, like, it goes by in the blink of an eye and you're done. So I actually kind of preferred that. Can I mention my senior who has helped me a lot and will continue to guide me during my residency if they ask why I'm interested in that program? Yeah, sure. Hannah, is it okay to use the same answer stories if interviewers from the same program ask similar questions? Yes. I've used similar questions or similar responses to multiple people who've asked me, because sometimes the interviewers don't coordinate. They kind of all go in with their own little agendas. So if they all ask you the same questions, you may give them, similar answers. And again, you can use similar stories. You need to kind of do an inventory, a reflection of all of your experiences. So like, you're going to have in the back of your mind like 6 or 7 stories or experiences that you can use to answer a lot of those different questions. And it's okay if you recycle those. Can you put some light on minor details like dressing, background, or any of the other important details? Yeah, so obviously make sure that you're dressed professionally, make sure that you have a good, strong Wi-Fi internet connection. Your background can be just a plain wall if you want, or it can be something, you can have a setup where maybe you have some pictures, if you like pictures of your family, or if you're an artist, a painting that you like, or if you're a musician, you can have like the instrument that you play in the background, or anything in the background that you want to put there. If it's something that is an interest of you, be prepared to talk about. But you can also just have a plain background, that's fine too. You just don't want to have like, bowls of food and, ramen wrappings and like beer bottles in the background. You want it to be professional. How to prepare for interview, which are interrogate kind of. So how to prepare for the interviews where they are interrogation. Those are less common. There's no way to prepare for that. You just need to get through it. If you're struggling in an interview and you feel like you're getting asked a lot of challenging questions, it's because everybody feels that way. It means that was just a pressure room. There's no way to prepare for that. In my experience, when I interviewed integrated plastic surgery, I think I only had like one pressure interview. Most of the interviews were very conversational. The reason being is like these programs want you to rank them highly as well. If the programs come across as very standoffish and everybody's really mean and interrogating you, no one's going to rank that program highly. Again, you are in a position of power here because you're going to create a rank list come February. And if you're, taking your notes at the end of the day, like I'm telling you to, and a program everybody was really mean and standoffish and all of the interviewers were asking you really difficult, challenging questions, write that in your assessment of the program. If that's the case, that might not be a program that you maybe want to train in. So, and I think most programs recognize that. So they are, they're going to try to be as nice to you as they can. Dual applying. What should I answer if a family medicine program director asks me if I'm applying to internal medicine since I did a couple of Roche? They're not going to ask you that. Especially if you're an international medical graduate, they're going to recognize that you're doing your U.S. clinical experiences and you're taking those U.S. clinical experiences and trying to just gather as many U.S. clinical experiences as they can. So if you're applying for family medicine and the family medicine PD asks about IM experiences, just say, I was applying broadly for U.S. clinical experiences, and I had a couple that were offered to me internal medicine, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity for me to get further exposure with inpatient medicine and, expose myself to the U.S. healthcare system. How do you suggest taking notes during the interview? If virtually I have a Word doc up and type notes, or do you recommend writing them down during the interview, or should I take the notes after the interview only? During the interview itself, if somebody is interviewing you, most of the time it's going to be conversational, right? You're not going to be like writing down notes. If they're talking about something that you need to take notes down, you can just ask them and just have a little notepad next to you and just say, do you mind if I take some notes? If they're telling you about places in the city to live or restaurant recommendations or different attendings that you should look up that have similar research, volunteer, outreach issues, just say, do you mind if I take some notes, and then just write it down? But I would write it down as opposed to typing, because then it could just make it look like you're doing work or something. So I would just ask them, and I would have a little notepad there where you can jot it down. All right, guys. Thank you very much for joining today. Thanks everybody who volunteered. Let me know if you guys found this to be useful. If you did, we could set another one of these sessions up, another webinar in a few weeks, and kind of do something similar. And again, please go to our website, take a look at our packages. If you think you need any help, if you benefit from those, please sign up. If you have any questions, please reach out to our WhatsApp message team. You'll talk to Ellie or one of our other tech people, and they will answer any questions you have and get you connected with us. So have a good rest of your day, evening, wherever you're joining us from, and thanks again for joining.